Rick, after your appearance on Mad Money with Jim Cramer, everybody wants to know one thing.
What's that?
In it, Jim referred to this as the Bat Cave. Now, we've been calling it the Volcano Lair. Which one is it? Is it the Volcano Lair or is it the Bat Cave?
I think we need to evolve.
All right.
I love the Batcave. I actually think Batman is a fantastic superhero to channel Axon, right? Because he's got really cool gadgets. He's a tech-based hero. I don't think he ever kills people. Almost all of his gadgets have some way of catching people alive.
Mm-hmm.
And look, Bruce Wayne's pretty badass. So I think we officially rebrand the Batcave.
You like that, Mark? The Bat Cave?
I love it.
The Bat Cave. All right. Let's get started here in the Bat Cave.
Here we go.
Risk. The final frontier. These are the stories of the Axon enterprise. Our mission to protect life, to seek amazing people, and live epic tales. Come, let us boldly go.
Well, we are going to boldly go today. Welcome to episode 9 of the podcast. We are super excited about the guest that we have today. We have a guy who is a world-renowned expert, Dr. Mark Kroll. He's a biomedical inventor and engineer. He holds over 400 plus patents in neuro and cardiac stimulation technology, including life-saving implantable defibrillators. He's a former CTO and board-level technologist at St. Jude Medical, where he oversaw the engineering behind devices now implanted in over, you know the number?
I don't.
Over 2 million patients worldwide. Mark is a leading authority and sought-after speaker on electrophysiology. He's the author or co-author of 125 plus peer-reviewed papers, and he has authored 4 textbooks on bioelectricity. I say that makes him an expert, don't you?
Yep. And I think if it's also a fact that everybody in the world today who has an implantable cardiac defibrillator, the device that saves you if you get a heart attack, has at least one Kroll patent in their chest. Is that still true?
Yes.
So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Mark Kroll.
Thank you. And I have to say, just for the record, that my mother really enjoyed talking to you guys to get that background information.
Well, before we get into the technology, let's talk a little bit about how we first met. Do you remember how we met, Mark?
Yes, I did.
All right. Why don't you start off the story?
Well, every family has weird habits and weird family dynamics. And in my family, you're expected to get patents. So my wife has several patents, and so do all 4 of my children. And my son Braden had an idea for a cheap, reusable cell phone. And then my son Chase, who hadn't hit his 12th birthday yet, said, why don't we add a TASER to that? Okay, so we got some patents on that. And then we approached the company, and Phil and Smith and Rick said, that's a really stupid idea.
I think we're a little more diplomatic than that.
No, but we like you, which is a nice way. I said, okay, fine, I guess I'm out the door. No, we mean it. We'd like you to get involved because we get accused of electrocuting people, and your specialty is effective shocks on the heart, and maybe we can work together. So that's how it started.
Yeah, from our side, I remember when this came in, we saw the patent. And the reason we decided sort of against it was, putting a weapon to your head every day on a practical basis.
What was it going to do?
It would be a cell phone with a TASER in it. But, which, by the way, very creative. And I don't know if you follow this, like his kid was less than...
He was 11.
He was 11 years old. Like that's when they start patenting in the Kroll family. But then I read Mark's resume, and we basically said, oh my Lord, like, this guy is a medical expert extraordinaire. Like, how valuable would he be to join us as a board member? And you did. And Mark then was on our board for 20 years, stood up our medical advisory board, and has become just a good friend and an incredible inventor and expert, helping us take each version of the TASER and make sure that it's as safe as possible, making it more effective. And we've just co-invented together a lot of great stuff. So Mark, it's been quite a run.
Yep. Been a joy.
So to start out, one of the critiques that some people have of Axon is that they allege we don't disclose any of the safety risks that are associated with TASER. So in fact, Mark, let's talk about what are the real risks and what do we talk about with risks with TASER weapons?
Well, we've published this. I mean, and yet give the company credit that you want everything out in the open. So I published the paper now about 8 years ago that showed the number of deaths from fatal falls, and it was 19 from fatal brain injury and 2 from cervical fractures. So that was about 21. There have been a few since then, but that really hasn't gone up a lot. And then fatal fires, mostly because people had gasoline on them, and the spark ignited the gasoline, and we got 10 deaths from that. I expect that to go to 0 because the T10 does not have any high voltage in it. So there are real risks. They are rare, but they are real, and the company warns about them.
You know what's interesting about this? These cases where we all agree that TASER played a direct causal role. It caused these people to fall down, and they sustained a lethal wound. Now, again, that's 31 cases out of around 4.5 million field uses.
Over how many years?
Over 30 years, I think. Mark, what's the exact?
That'd be about right. At the time we did this, it was a little over 20 years, but these numbers haven't changed that much.
Mm-hmm.
Training has improved.
And so the risk is 1 in 150,000 field uses. That's pretty extraordinarily low for a weapon.
It's a lot safer than going in the hospital, and a lot safer than general anesthesia.
And I think, the data that you refer to when you say it's safer than playing volleyball or some of the other comparisons that you make, you're referring to this data that...
No, they were actually referring to relative injury risks. So we'll come back to that one. That's a little different from the risk of fatalities, but certainly much lower than you've seen just about anywhere else. Now, what's interesting about this is these are not the cases you ever see in the news because they're not controversial. People understand this is what happened. The cases you tend to hear about in the news are when there's not a clear cause of death, at least not one that links the TASER. And that's where there's all this controversy about, does the TASER impact somebody's heart? That's the allegation. And in fact, I think that's part of what we're going to get into today, because the cases where TASER actually didn't play a role, or may have played only a minor role, are the ones that gather all the attention. And we're going to go into that. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about what are the benefits. So obviously, if there have been a few fatalities, there should be some benefits to deploying these things.
Well, the best studies were sponsored by the United States Department of Justice under Attorney General Eric Holder. And one is the McDonald study with about 24,000 uses of force covering 12 law enforcement agencies. And they defined suspect injuries very broadly, and those were reduced by 2/3. And that was followed by the Taylor study with 12,000 uses of force, 13 agencies, and they looked at suspect injuries requiring medical attention. That was reduced by 80%. So it was a 5-to-1 reduction in injuries compared to alternative control techniques such as canines, batons, or wrestling.
Got it. And let's talk about police shootings. What's the impact there?
Well, there it's where the weapon can be used in an agency that gives up police officers discretion in using it. They don't have extreme restrictions. And I want to comment on that. But in general, it's 2/3. Fatal shootings are reduced by 2/3. And one of the ironic things that came out of that study is they looked at agencies where they had severe restrictions on the usage, and there the fatal shootings were not reduced as much. And the irony of that is, because of the electrocution innuendo that was popular 10 to 15 years ago, many agencies severely restricted the use of the weapon. And ironically, that led to a lot of deaths. So, but in general, it reduces fatal shootings by 2/3.
Yep. And when you mention overly restrictive, like what are some examples of that? Either you or...
Well, there are examples where an agency may, for example, there some of the critics have pushed for this to say, well, we should treat the TASER at the same level as lethal force. And so if you raise the TASER up to lethal force, then the fact is, if a police officer is in a situation where I'm now authorized to use my gun, they're going to use their gun. They're not going to choose the TASER in that moment. So what you've effectively done is taken the TASER off the table from being a viable intervention. The idea is you use this earlier, before you're now at the point where someone's charging you with a knife or pointing a gun at you.
Which, again, I mean, it tends to be pushed by folks who aren't exactly friendly to police, and what they're doing is increasing the chance of an injury or officer-involved shooting leading to a fatality.
Yeah, Mark, would you agree, or what do you see in the restrictions?
Well, that's exactly the case, and we have a sad but very effective statistical control in the 4th Judicial District for the United States Courts of Appeals, which is Alabama to Virginia. There is an appeals court decision that held that you had to have active resistance. You can't just have a passive resistance or some other concern, or an officer's experience telling him that this is going to lead to prolonged resistance. So you got to wait for this guy to actively resist you. And what are you going to do with that guy? If the guy comes at you, you don't really have time to holster your TASER electrical weapon and pull out your firearm, so you might be going to the firearm first. And so other studies, one particular study compared 4th Circuit versus the rest of the country and found this big difference, where the fatal shootings were not reduced significantly. So it's a real tragic outcome of electrophobia, the fear that an electric weapon is electrocuting these people.
Yeah, and I would say, that's a really important thing. There was a recent, we get hit in the media all the time. There was a recent one from John Oliver. We're going to actually have a whole episode dedicated to that. But the downside is they throw a lot of innuendo that the TASER is electrocuting people and that it's more dangerous than it is. And the downside is that causes public reactions. In some cases, if I remember way back in 2005 or 6, some agencies pulled the TASER off the street. And there were some fatalities that occurred when the TASER was not available. Or they'll move it up the force curve to the point where it becomes unusable.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I guess the other thing we should say is, look, none of us are saying that the TASER should be used instead of talking. If an officer can use their verbal skills, get the situation under control, they absolutely should. But what we're talking about here is when it begins to escalate, if you say you can't use the TASER until lethal force is justified, they're going to go straight to their gun. In fact, Greg Meyer, a captain out of LAPD, calls this phenomenon talking people to death, where if your judgment says this is going to escalate, but you have to keep talking until the subject makes the first move, then you're going straight to fatal force. Actually, one of the things I'd like to talk about, there was a study that was sponsored by actually a company that was a competitor, and they sponsored a session at the Potomac Policy Institute, a well-known think tank. And the reason I mentioned it was sponsored by a competitor is they were putting a lot of pressure on this think tank to come out and say that TASERs are deadly or dangerous. But in fact, what came out of it was the Policy Institute looked at this and they said, well, you know what? Yes, TASERs do occasionally cause a fatality. But they said, even if you assume every time a death happens after a TASER, if you assume the TASER caused it, we would still have a ratio of 70 lives saved for every one lost. And they compared that to automotive airbags, something I think we all understand. These devices save lives. Occasionally, an airbag does cause a fatality. They've got a saves ratio of 50-1 versus 70-1. Now, Mark, you and I were talking about this beforehand, and I was mentioning that this is assuming every death following a TASER use, within proximity. I think the number gets a lot better if we actually winnow it down to the cases where the TASER actually played a role.
Yeah, both these numbers have improved a lot. The original airbags were somewhat dangerous, but they've improved those a lot, and having children sit in the back seats and not expose the airbag, and having weight sensors in the passenger seat, for example. So the airbag number has gone up a fair bit. But a modern number for the impact for the TASER weapons would be closer to about 1,000-1 benefit. If you look at the people that died in spite of the TASER weapon, in other words, because we know that these reduce deaths dramatically, firearm and non-firearm, and you look at cases where there's an arrest due to death even though the weapon was used, and then blame that on the use of the TASER weapon, that's a little over 1 a week. And there's about 150, well, that's not the most relevant number, but I'll just say it. I'll finish it, but 150 non-firearm arrest due to deaths where the weapon was not used at all, which shows that 2/3 reduction in deaths in general. But for firearm non-firearm arrest-related deaths prevented, it's many, many hundreds, and shooting deaths prevented many, many hundreds. So you could say it's about maybe 1,000 deaths per year prevented versus maybe 1 per year now from fatal falls. So it's about 1,000 to 1 benefit.
Now, when you say deaths in spite of TASER, that would be, I think our critics would say that's a controversial term, or they would disagree with you. Tell me why you use this term, deaths in spite of TASER.
Well, the best way to explain this is with a cancer analogy. Let's imagine that you came up with a drug that cured lung cancer 2/3 of the time. In other words, it reduced mortality by 2/3. You'd get a Nobel Prize. Nobody would say, well, you're poisoning these 1/3 of the people that die. So here we are saving, let's say, 1,000 lives per year. But in spite of that, there's maybe at least 1 a week that's dying regardless. And if we have some time, I'd like to talk about the horrible health conditions of the people that do die resisting arrest. There's an innuendo that somehow the weapon is electrocuting those people, but it's not, because they have so many comorbidities that they're just not going to survive the fight. Well, that's why it's totally unfair to have this electrocution innuendo.
Well, and let's talk at a very high level. How can you say definitively that the TASER isn't electrocuting these people? Because they've got these other things going on, but what gives you confidence that it's not the TASER?
Well, we've been studying electrocution for 150 years since we started electrifying Europe and the eastern U.S. in the 1880s. So we know exactly how electrocution works. We know how much current it takes, and we know what happens afterwards. We know if someone's electrocuted, they have a rhythm called ventricular fibrillation. And so we know the weapon does not put out enough to cause a death. That does not put out enough to electrocute. And there's lots of ways to eliminate these deaths. These people with drug overdose, they typically present to the EMTs with a flat line, asystole, for example. That's not a rhythm you can get from electricity. So we can eliminate the electrocution hypothesis completely. And then...
Well, hold on a second. Let's go deep on this, because I think this is really important. 2 things. Number one, if electricity is going to stop your heart, and that is the allegation in these cases where there's not an obvious other cause of death other than maybe some of these medical conditions. But if the electricity was to stop the heart, how long would the time be between when the TASER is used and their heart stops?
Electrocution takes 1 to 2 seconds to occur.
Got it. And so in most of these cases, the TASER is used, the person suffers a medical crisis, and we'll talk about all the medical conditions that are involved, drugs and heart conditions, and they suffer cardiac arrest an hour later. What you're saying is that can't be electrocution from the TASER.
Absolutely, it can.
Okay.
Electricity does not get stored in the body. Electricity is different from things like a poison where you take it in the mouth and stays in there. Electricity requires 2 wires. There's a real important reason. It comes in one wire, goes out the other. It does not linger. It comes in, and if it goes through the heart, as enough goes through the heart, it'll kill you. That's electrocution. It doesn't linger and build up like poison.
All right, now let's go into, you also mentioned there's a different heart rhythm called asystole, which you cannot cause with electricity. And that's going to be critical in some of these cases where a TASER was used and somebody died. But first, describe for us, what is the difference? What is ventricular fibrillation and what is asystole?
Ventricular fibrillation is a chaotic rhythm in the heart where the heart's still generating electrical signals. The cells are very much alive, and they are going around chaotically. These waves are going around the heart. It's like an electrical riot is probably the best description.
Hey, hold on 1 second. Let me put when you and I were talking about this years ago, there was this analogy that if, here, let me get this on camera. If you're clapping your hands, that's the heart beating. Fibrillation is the hands are quivering, everything's still moving, but they're no longer synchronized. And so the individual cells are still sort of beating, but they're quivering, they're not coordinated. That's ventricular fibrillation. And that can be caused by high doses of electricity.
Yes.
We've not seen it with the TASER, and we'll get into that. But all right, so if all the cells quivering out of control is ventricular fibrillation, what is asystole then?
Asystole is what lay people would call flatline. If you ever watch a movie, somebody in a hospital that's dying, that you see the beep, beep, beep on the monitor, then it suddenly goes flatline. That's not, they're leaving out the VF, because normally you're going to go into VF for half an hour and then they'll try to defibrillate you and then you go into flatline. But that tone, that's the flatline. That's asystole.
But now you just said people can go into ventricular fibrillation and then half an hour later into asystole. So what is happening in the field when you have somebody who collapses and they're in asystole, they're not in VF? Like what's causing that?
The most common cause of asystole in the field would be a drug overdose. That's the classic electrocardiographic presentation for a drug overdose or extreme exertion. What technically happens is you normally are sitting at a pH of 7.4. It means you're not acidic at all. If you're walking, you may be 7.35. If you start exerting yourself, that pH starts going down. You start getting more and more acidic. Now, a trained Olympic athlete can work down below a 7 pH. These people are not trained Olympic athletes. Their pH starts getting down towards 7. They are misfunctioning pretty badly. And when that pH gets down, then it starts going down because the lungs are not working as well. And you get the pH down around 6.8, you don't have enough acidity for the heart cells to function, and they shut off. And that is what gives you the asystole.
So as I was preparing for today, I actually went out and I was doing some research, and the Cleveland Clinic has published a bunch on this. I mean, this is not controversial, this idea that if you get severe metabolic acidosis, where your blood pH becomes very acidic, and of course that's from the lactic acid and the CO2 building up, that will cause your heart to stop. There's nothing controversial about that statement, correct?
That's correct. And it wouldn't have to be asystole. There's another related rhythm called pulseless electrical activity, where there is still some electrical activity, but there's no mechanical connection between the cells. So the linkage between the cells for this contraction is no longer functioning. That can also be caused by acidity. But you still see some electrical activity, but you're in a cardiac arrest, and it's not VF.
Now, recently there's been certainly some controversy about this term excited delirium. We're going to generally set that aside for today because I want to focus on the stuff that's not controversial, and that is this. You literally, well, let me take a step back. Our fatigue mechanism is the way our body saves us from metabolic acidosis. Like if you were working out really hard, you're hitting a heavy bag, punching bag really hard, you can become pretty acidic. And when your brain senses that, it slows you down, right? You get fatigue and you physically don't feel like you can move. It's my understanding that what happens with people on certain drugs like methamphetamine, PCP, cocaine, they don't feel pain and they don't feel fatigue. And therefore, they can continue to exert themselves even as their body's in this dangerous state. And in fact, they could push their blood pH down to where it becomes fatal. Is that?
That's exactly right. It can also happen in a psychotic break. They don't get tired. They don't feel pain. They literally fight until they're dead. And the only way to save them is to inject them with ketamine so they stop fighting. But that's pretty tricky.
Got it. Or, folks have recommended, in fact, the TASER may be the best way to get these people medical care rather than fighting them with multiple officers for 5 or 10 minutes. If you can get them under control quickly,
absolutely,
we might be able to save them.
Right. If you can stop their exertion, you could save them because now you're reducing that metabolic load. And then you want to put them on their stomach so they can't kick as much because the thigh muscles are your largest muscles for this. If they're on their back, they can kick a lot. So this is why proning is so life-saving, which, again, that's another area where a very life-saving police technique gets blamed for these cases. But yes, but the use of the muscle lockup can save these people. They're not exerting themselves.
All right, so I actually now want to let's talk about these walking time bombs. Like, what are the things that we see that are danger signals with people that police may have to interact with?
Well, my colleagues and I have been looking at arrest-related death, and we define this as people that died resisting arrest. And the term is not perfect because in the majority cases, they are not being arrested for criminal activity. They are trying to be controlled so they can get them an ambulance and save their life. But this is the term that the United States Department of Justice uses. So my colleagues and I have adopted. Other people use different terms. And we've been working on several papers in this area. And one of the things we're looking at is heart disease. That'll be the next paper to come out. And then it'll be the drug levels. And what we find is that 2/3 of these people have significant heart disease. And by that, I mean subclinical significant heart disease. So it's undetected, untreated. And then 3/4 of them have illicit drugs, primarily meth, PCP, or cocaine. And almost half of them have both of those conditions. So it's only 8% of them that do not either have significant subclinical heart disease or high levels of illicit drugs.
Now, by the way, I want to make a quick point here. We may have some people watching this show who may have had family members involved in some of these incidents. And so I want to be respectful and say, look, anytime a life is lost, that is a tragedy for the families involved, and that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. However, we have to be able to talk about the science to take a step back and really understand what's happening here. And so when we point out that most of these people are under heavily influence of drugs, we're not making a judgment call. I mean, my family's been hit by it. I'm sure yours have too. We're not saying these people deserve to die. But, Mark, is the long-term use of these stimulants associated? Doesn't that cause some of these heart problems?
Yes, and especially methamphetamine and cocaine, they will cause the heart to enlarge and thicken the walls, which makes you very prone to a fatal arrhythmia.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned looking at mental health is out there and co-occurring disorders, substance abuse, and underlying heart conditions. I mean, that's certainly why it makes the news today. If you talk to any police leader, the crisis on the streets that officers deal with suspects that are in mental health crisis / substance abuse crisis has increased. I think now it's like 1 in 5 911 calls involve someone either in a mental health crisis / and substance abuse crisis, or I think that the stat is up to close to 35% of all use of force incidents involve somebody who's in a mental health crisis. So they may have all the other things as well, but that number has steadily risen over the past decade and a half.
Well, there's good peer-reviewed data out of the U.S. and Canada that shows that 80% of the people that resist arrest are either on the influence of an illegal drug or massively intoxicated. We're not talking about a couple of Bud Lights, talking about 0.20 or above. Or
80%.
80%, yeah. There's some excellent papers on this. Or mental health and severe mental health. We're not talking about having a bad day. We're talking about bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, and schizophrenia. Rational, sober people generally don't fight with the police. They may not want to go to jail. Who does? But it's the 80% of these cases are involving drugs, extreme levels of alcohol intoxication, or mental illness. And I want to separate fentanyl from this because people, tragic deaths of fentanyl, and we all know people have lost family members to fentanyl. Those don't happen on the street.
No.
You go to sleep at home. That's still a tragedy, but those are not involved here.
So these drugs involving police tend to be the stimulants that are making people more violent, more active, in many cases more psychotic.
Absolutely.
So if I come back and I look at our list here, so we've got, you just mentioned, I think 80% of police interactions have mental illness or alcohol, and yet the critics are saying you shouldn't use a taser on people that are under the influence of drugs, mental illness, or alcohol, which would effectively disarm the police from the lowest injury rate option they have when these people become violent.
It's ironic, isn't it?
It certainly is. Okay, now a couple of other things you mentioned. What are channelopathies? You mentioned that as a risk.
In about 1/3 of the cases, you can't diagnose a sudden death. A molecular autopsy, or looking at the genetic predisposition for arrhythmias, will find a channelopathy. So each heart cell has different channels that control the electrical activity of the heart cell. And you have this genetic disorder. These are called Brugada syndrome, long QT syndrome, for example. And those make you prone to sudden death. You don't detect those at the autopsy. people get this because they are wearing a monitor or something like that, or a family member dies and everybody gets tested. The only way you can see this after the fact is from testing the blood and then doing the genetic sequencing for those problems. But that is a big risk, especially in the younger people.
How do you know then that these channelopathies are present in some of these people who die in police custody?
Well, we don't know for sure, but we can by doing the molecular autopsy, which is standard practice on Ontario, California, generally not done in the United States, unfortunately, because the test used to cost $8,000. Now it's about $1,000. It's a lot cheaper. It should be done. Standard practice in Switzerland, for example, but here our budget is under $1,000 for the whole autopsy, so there's no budget for it.
This is actually a really interesting thing because, again, we were recently criticized that Axon, when there's a death in police custody involving a TASER, we send them a checklist. And that checklist is to help them make sure they gather all the information they need. So it would seem like doing a channelopathy during the test for this during autopsy would be advisable.
We send the checklist to the medical examiner, the ME. Is that what you're saying?
No, we send it normally to the police department because they're gathering the evidence for the medical examiner.
Mm-hmm.
And another great example was many times when somebody collapses in police custody, they'll put a cardiac defibrillator on them, and that will gather what sort of rhythm they're in, their heart rhythm is in. And that's super important because if they're in asystole, it's a very different cause. It's usually a metabolic cause, not an electrical cause. But many times the police don't know to ask the fire department to give them a copy of the recordings of the heart. Again, that's another thing that goes into our checklist. Which is like, it's like we all want to get to the right answer, and a big part of that is knowing what to test for. So let's also talk about, Mark, you mentioned cardiac capture myopathy. Describe that concept for us.
This has been demonstrated in many species of animals. You can capture an animal with a trap, really nice, painless trap with food and water, and they're trapped in. A lot of them will just fall over dead. The loss of freedom is so hard on them, cause such a systemic stress. And Spaniards first suggested this as a contributing problem to arrest-related death, because not many people want to go to jail. You don't want to lose your freedom. Our freedom is precious. So you take control of somebody, you don't want to go to jail, you don't want to lose your freedom, and there may be some mechanism there that leads you to death. Some central systemic stress reaction that causes you to die. And it's been demonstrated in multiple animal species in multiple studies.
Put it another way, as you and I have talked about this, sudden cardiac death is the number one cause of death in America, right? 350,000 people. And is it one of the precipitating factors, stress, that could take somebody who's in a delicate state and push them over the edge? It would seem to me that the stress of being arrested and fighting with the police and all of this, is that sort of playing into this idea of capture myopathy?
Well, acute stress can, in very rare cases, just acute emotional stress, kill you. There was a study out of England by Krexy where they looked at people that died suddenly with so-called normal autopsies, and they dug into them in great detail. And a few of them were just from getting a phone call that a loved one had died. A few of them were for taking an important examination. Excuse me. A few of them were for just taking an important examination in school. There have been cases where people were in a car accident, belted in, airbags deployed, absolutely no injury, and they're dead. So, yes, acute stress can do that. Generally, for heart disease, it's prolonged stress.
Got it. All right, well, let's now talk a little bit more in detail about the impact of drugs, or the prevalence in particular of drug use in these instances.
Well, like I said, 3/4 of the arrest-related deaths feature the dangerous drugs of meth, PCP, or cocaine. But a fascinating study just came out less than 2 years ago out of Australia in a prestigious journal, Heart Rhythm. And they looked at people that died at home with drugs in them or not drugs in them. They just looked at young people that died at home, no police involvement. The number one drug was marijuana. It beat out meth and cocaine put together.
Wow.
So there's an increasing appreciation that THC can trigger sudden death in people.
Yeah.
And an increasing use of marijuana, especially among younger kids, and the THC levels are increasing.
Yes, and they think it's harmless. You don't get a hangover. Now, it can work two ways. It's being increasingly recognized as a risk of sudden death. It's been long recognized as the number one risk factor for developing schizophrenia, which can be a big factor in arrest-related death as well. But that's a longer term.
All right, so let's now start to pivot to talk about the history of sort of deaths in police custody and the different, I don't know what you'd call them, factors that the police critics have put forth, alleging as the clear cause here. And I think we just want to mention this is a serious topic, but at times, there can be some dark humor, I guess, in some of the situations. I don't know if you have anything you'd want to add there before we start talking a little more seriously about these theories that have been put forward.
Well, it's a deadly serious topic, but some of the crazy scapegoats that have been thrown at police are ridiculous to the point of absurd humor, maybe is the best way to put it.
Got it. Now, maybe one of those earlier you had mentioned things about studies about people being prone, put on their stomach. And you were actually saying that is associated, that actually is a good idea to try to restrain somebody. And yet it's blamed for police putting people on their stomach that they can't breathe. Let's sort of give us your thoughts on that.
Well, the linkage is very straightforward. It's a classic case of correlation versus causation. As Mike knows, police officer trained to prone someone, they're resistant. It's preferred for multiple reasons. If somebody's on their back kicking you, you can't really handcuff them, right? So it's standard training since the 1930s to prone somebody out. And it can be life-saving because now they can't kick with their legs, they can't hurt you, they can't overexhaust themselves and get acidotic. So if you wanted to blame police for an arrest-related death, you want to look at everything they did, and there's the proning. Maybe we should blame the proning. Mm-hmm. Now, there were isolated studies that showed that proning improved oxygenation. Those were kind of ignored until COVID. And then once COVID hit, you had all these people in the hospital that were near death from respiratory distress. Proning was rediscovered. And now we have maybe 30 studies that shown that proning improves oxygen flow. And so this idea that there's something wrong with proning is so nonsensical. It's, well, maybe dark humor is the right thing, but it's just shocking.
And so to put this maybe in context, is this idea of like if an officer is holding somebody down, people are basically making the allegation that they're asphyxiating people, or that the position of putting them face down is causing you've used this analogy, you've been looking at, in sports, this happens. Like, so take us down a little further. Do you believe, what should police officers do if they have a violent resisting person? Should they place them face down as they try to arrest them and hold them down, or if not that, then what?
Well, I don't know how else you can handcuff them, frankly. And so the ideal thing that appears to work is get them down with an electrical weapon, lock their muscles, and then cuff them as quickly as you can. Maybe restrain the legs so they can't kick and make themselves acidotic.
Got it. Well, if we think about, in these cases, anytime somebody dies in police custody, there is a massive incentive people maybe don't talk about enough. And that is, when we hear the term civil rights attorney, it's got a pretty positive glow.
Correct.
But in fact, civil rights attorneys are also the class of attorneys who basically sue police departments for a living, and they earn their living
Suing
by
departments.
proving if police played a role. And so and I believe legally, the law is such that even if the police play a very minor role, they have to pay the entire legal bill for the attorney who sues. So this does create a pretty strong incentive to try to prove that it was the police's fault in these cases, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's where you see it sort of feels no matter what the police do, there's going to be theories about, how the police behavior is what caused this.
Or you'll also hear, certainly from police leaders and others, saying it's become a habit. I'm sure you've seen this, Dr. Kroll, that easier to pay out early than to fight the case and jeopardize, and the insurance will pay it out, the city's insurance provider, versus fighting it out and perhaps paying millions and millions later.
I'm not sure what the statistics are, but that makes sense to me.
Yeah, so just coming back to it, to sort of put the point home, you believe that there's no science that supports this idea that placing somebody on their stomach is causing asphyxia. Is that an overstatement? Or
No, that's absolutely true. Otherwise, it wouldn't improve oxygenation in these COVID patients, and you wouldn't have 50 million Americans who sleep on their tummy. I sleep on my stomach. It hasn't killed me so far.
Yeah. All right. And then in terms of field studies, the field studies are supporting this as well, right? That it doesn't support this theory that police holding somebody down to handcuff them is leading them.
That's correct. And now, there's no question that you have to prone somebody to get them handcuffed. Reasonable people can argue about what's the best position after handcuffing, whether they should be on their back, on their side, or on their tummy.
Is there a consensus on that?
Scientific consensus is you should probably keep them prone. That's what the data says. So we've got studies by Hall in Canada, Ross in the U.S., and Lasoff also. They looked at 8,000 uses of force, in which roughly half the people were left on their side after handcuffing and half of them were left prone. There was only one death, and that was the guy who was put on his side. They ironically refer to this as a recovery position, but there's no recovery whatsoever. This is another one of these weird myths that developed in the 1890s when a physician had a female stroke victim, turned her on her side in a hospital bed. She miraculously recovered, so he called this the recovery position, and it's taught to this day, and yet there is zero evidence supporting. In fact, people with really say they're in their heart failure, the worst thing you can do is put them on their left side, because now you're getting blood pooling in the heart. So this is another one of these mythical things that just makes no sense and makes it much more difficult for law enforcement officers to do their job.
All right, so we've talked a bit about some of the other underlying causes. Let's talk about electrocution. How does electricity stimulate the body, and what's it actually doing? Mark, just take us down the road here.
Well, if you want to accuse the TASER weapon of killing somebody, it's not through a fall or a fire. It would be electrocution. That's right out of the dictionary. A death caused by electrocution. That's it. It turns out we know a lot about electrocution. Like I mentioned before, it's been studied with a lot of peer-reviewed papers going back 150 years and maybe 170 if you look at some of the less formal things. And we know that there are different levels of electricity and they have different effects. If you start with, say, 1 milliampere of alternating current, you can start sensing it. At about 5, it's pretty painful. And then around 16, you can get muscle lockup, which is equivalent roughly of where the TASER electrical weapons are. They don't put out alternating currents, so I'm having to do a currency conversion here because it's pulse DC, it's not AC, but you get the same idea for the degrees. And then once you get up into the very high currents, roughly about 200 milliamperes, and if it's through the chest, so it's someone's getting the heart, you can kill somebody. But to say that the low current from the taser weapon is going to electrocute somebody is like saying that you can be killed by a tennis ball hitting you in the butt, or an adult killed by a tennis ball, versus a bowling ball or something like that hitting you in the head. Or let's just keep it to the head. Say a tennis ball, the head might hurt. And so we know the difference between different levels of current.
And I have to say, because I've been in the lab when we're tuning tasers, usually you do it with anesthetized pigs because you have to be able to measure what's happening.
Yeah.
We do exactly this. We anesthetize the animal so it won't feel anything, so we can't tell where the sensation threshold is, but then we tune up the electricity until we're getting these strong muscle contractions, because that's what we're designing the system to do, is to paralyze the muscles by contracting them so that they can't relax. And then once we get there, we stop, and that's where we tune the taser to. Then in pigs, we will continue to take the current up, right across the heart until we can cause ventricular fibrillation. So we actually will test all the way up to see where the danger threshold is, so that we're tuning our weapon to be as far away from the danger threshold as possible, and yet as effective as we need to be. And that's really the trade-off. And in fact, we found the safety margins are something like 16 to 1, 20 to 1. There's a huge safety margin. In fact, we've gotten criticized at times for pointing out that we have a greater safety margin than some common articles. Like, I think you and I talked about this, Tylenol.
Yeah, Tylenol. If you take high-strength Tylenol, which is 500 milligrams, maximum dose is 4 of those. That's 2 grams. That's considered okay. But even for a non-alcoholic liver, at 15 grams, you can die. So tragically, it's very common use for suicide. And someone that's got an alcoholic liver, you can die from a lot less than that. So you've got safety margins in the single digits.
So just to be clear, we've said, and it's scientifically true, that taser has a higher safety margin between the effective dose and the lethal dose than Tylenol. We've stopped saying that publicly because some people have said we're tone deaf, or that we're overstating the safety of taser weapons. But what a remarkable achievement to have a weapon that does have a higher margin between the dose we deliver and the potentially lethal dose than over-the-counter medications.
Very true.
And I think that's where this analogy, we talk about like a tennis ball versus a wrecking ball. Like, if you're getting hit physically with something, the quantum matters, how heavy or how big the thing is. And the same is true of electricity. The quantum matters. Not all electricity is dangerous. In fact, as I'm sitting here right now, I couldn't live without electricity. My brain is using electricity to control my breathing and my body and my heart. Very high doses of electricity are dangerous, but we're well below those levels.
Absolutely true.
All right, so let's shift now to talk about safety standards. Now, this is, I know, really your area of expertise, Mark. So how does the taser relate to electrical safety levels?
Well, as you can imagine, because electricity is so common in our lives, you've got many, many safety standards. There's one primary one, which is the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission standard, which defines how much it takes to kill you by electricity. And that's IEC 60479. And I've sat on that committee for the last 10 years with the world's experts on electrocution. In fact, we'll be meeting with them in September in Delhi, India, to work on the latest update. And this, for the particular issue of pulsed direct current or rapid pulses, this 479 update shows that the weapon is not capable of electrocution. But there are a lot of other standards that have been around for a long time that also support that. The electric fence standards have been around since the 40s, and they allow 5 watts in the USA, 5 to 7 watts depending upon the waveform, and all the taser weapons put out less than 2 watts. ANSI has a special standard for electrical weapons, and that shows that the taser products are very safe. And ANSI is recognized as the safety standard source for safety glasses, bicycle helmets, motorcycle helmets, etc. So we know from just reading these safety standards that we're not electrocuting people.
Put it another way, you've got some humorous slides I've seen you use where you talk about electric fences versus the taser. Walk us through that.
Well, the first electrical weapon technically was the electric fence, and promoted by Mark Twain in his novel Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Is there the Connecticut Yankee that went back in time suggests to use electric fence to defend King Arthur's forces from the bad guys. And then these were used in World War I, where they were set at lethal levels. Obviously not a good thing, but they became very popular for farms, and there were a lot of fatalities. So Underwriters Laboratory started studying this in the 30s, and a number of standards went in.
We said there were fatalities. That's because people were just doing stuff like plugging their electric outlet into the fence.
Exactly. That's basically what it was, yeah. And so then standards were set to keep these outputs very low. And the worst case scenario is a barefoot 12-year-old farm kid walking an electric fence at chest high, right over the heart. That's absolute worst case scenario. And so these are limited to 5 watts in the U.S. Like I said, 5 to 7, depending on the waveform. And your weapons are way under that, under 2 watts general. So just from that standard for the first electrical weapon, you know you're not electrocuting people. So we know the exception is you have to get current in the heart, right? If you had a probe that went in between the 4th or 5th intercostal space, in other words, between the 4th and 5th, the 5th and 6th ribs, in a really skinny person, and they, like maybe let's say a 10-year-old, and they pushed it all the way in so it touched the heart, they would be electrocuted. But you basically would have to touch the heart. And so that's not happened yet.
And how do you know that? You would have to touch the heart. Let's talk about the experiments that have looked into that issue.
Well, the United States Department of Justice sponsored studies at the University of Wisconsin with a very famous biomedical scientist, John Webster. And they took pigs and they put probes in them, and they moved the probe closer and closer and closer to the heart until they fibrillated the pig. And then on average, they had to be 6 millimeters away. And we know that pigs are 3 times as sensitive to electricity as human hearts because of the way their hearts are wired.
So let me see if I learned this from you correctly. Yeah. The way their hearts are wired, the electrical circuits that control the beating of the heart on a human, I think they're called Purkinje fibers, they're on the inside of the heart. On the pig, they're on the outside of the heart. So
they go through. They go through the wall. It's transmural.
Okay.
Purkinje fibers. So you can stimulate the outside of the heart and goes right to the inside, spreads around, and it causes fibrillation. So pigs are exquisitely sensitive to electrocution.
And when we talked about this years ago, that was one of the reasons you advocated that we should use pigs as a testing model because they're so sensitive. We know if we don't fibrillate a pig, then we're not going to fibrillate a human.
That's absolutely correct. They are extremely sensitive. They make for a very conservative safety model.
On that, Dr. Kroll is obviously a world-renowned expert in electricity, and Rick, you talk about it a lot. Just go back to the electric fence thing, because it was hit, and we're all, those who are not as familiar with it as you guys are in the way you talk about it, but the electric fence analogy just sort of struck me as we're talking about it. So as you said, it's 5 to 7 watts, depending, and a taser is 2 watts. So, it is less than half of what, if you've ever encountered an electric fence, like you know what that is, but that, again, the taser is less than half of that at 2 watts. Is that the way to think about it, Doug?
Yes, that's fair.
All right, so let's now pivot to, the public perception of electricity. One of the real challenges we have is people are innately afraid of electricity, and it can be dangerous, especially, the outlet in your wall that's connected to the nuclear power plant, outside of town, has limitless electrical energy it can push through you.
Well, Rick, I didn't have electrophobia, as Dr. Kroll mentioned that term earlier, until you just said that. But go ahead.
Well, don't stick your finger in a light socket. Like, it's hooked up to massive amounts of power. By comparison, the TASER is running on the same batteries that power a digital camera. But here I'm showing this. Remember this headline, Mark, from back in 2005? This was sort of the peak of, I think, what we could now fairly say was a hysteria about TASER weapons. And this was USA Today, and they'd put out this article, and they basically said that the TASER was 1,000 times more current than an electric chair. And the electric current is what makes it dangerous. And it just turns out the reporter was really bad at math. We didn't have 1,000 times more current. We have 1,000 times less current. So they were off by a factor of 1,000,000. And they put this picture on the front of USA Today showing the TASER next to the electric chair. And that was driving the public debate. And it was frankly very counterproductive. I mean, some people died because agencies panicked and raised TASER on the use of force or pulled it off altogether. We went back, we actually sued Gannett to try to get a retraction on this. And they did a little retraction in the classified section, nowhere near the front page. And
I mean, that's literally journalistic malpractice because you're costing lives because of that, or you costed lives because of that.
Or we've seen these dramatic images of, police electrocuting people. It's, but it doesn't, we're not electrocuting people. So in fact, what does the electricity do then? What do we do as people?
It's an electronic muscle stimulator, primarily. And you can go on Amazon now and buy electronic muscle stimulators for $30 to $80 to tone up your six-pack. I've bought a number of them for testing, and I can tell you that it's not brought my six-pack back yet, but I'm not going to give up. Hopefully the tonal machine will do that for me.
That is an amazing machine.
And so things are used every day, and the FDA approves these. There are several models that you can buy on Amazon, FDA approved, that put out more current than the present models of TASER weapons. We now go back to current instead of power in watts. These can put out up to 2 milliamperes, and the TASER X26E was up there, but the T7 and the X2 are lower, as well as the T10. And you can buy full body workout body suits that put a total of 48 milliamperes in your body. You put these things on, you get a workout that's exhausting. Now, to be totally fair, the only difference is because they're trying to stimulate a workout. So they contract for 3 seconds and then they release for 3 seconds. So it's not continuous. But still, the FDA approves these off-the-shelf devices for 40 to 45 minutes. Since it's 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off, let's say it's worth 20 minutes for the output of your TASER electrical weapons.
So, and there's been a lot of debate and folks saying that, the TASER, boy, I'm going to open a can of worms here because this is a big topic, but that long durations are allegedly dangerous because we had put out at various times that you should try to minimize the duration of a TASER exposure. And I think our intention there was largely, like any use of force, you shouldn't use any more than is necessary, and it is uncomfortable. You should only be using the TASER for as long as is necessary to get the person under control. There were other groups that came out and sort of made this allegation that electricity was building up like a poison, and if you kept it on too long, that it would kill you. But I think what you're pointing out here, Mark, is that the FDA is basically saying devices with even more current output are safe for up to 45 minutes.
That's correct. But again, it's 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off. So you should really, to be fair, cut that in half.
Got it.
One of futurist Peter Diamandis, someone you're very familiar with, he wears a catalyst suit, does just that. That's his recommendation for sort of how people work out in the future. It saves time, stimulates the muscles, and helps. I thought about buying one, but I'm not sure. I like my tonal too much right now. I will say on the one thing I've seen you do, Rick, over the past probably 24 months more is to buy those devices off of Axon, buy those devices off of Amazon, and when we do demos, put them on a police customer or community member, and it really, like, that proves the point, like that, because all you see is the muscle contraction. You see the hand, and they have that sort of surprise. I think that really has been a sort of game changer in how we think about demonstrating a taser versus deploying probes, and you're going to fall down.
It is, yeah, showing people that that's our intended and designed purpose is to contract the muscles. It does not deliver high voltage that could burn you or electrocute you. It just locks your muscles up. So let's get to talk about some of the myths. What are the myths that we have to debunk when it comes to taser weapons?
Well, you kind of led into this, the baseball rule. And I call it the baseball rule because that's the only source I can think of for where it came from. We're used to 3 strikes and you're out. And somebody at a police medical conference 20 years ago said, well, should be limited to 3 trigger pulls or 15 seconds, which is really absurd when you think about it. That's saying that 14 seconds is safe, but 16 is not. And you're supposed to transition after 3 trigger pulls to what? A firearm? No, maybe another cartridge, because it really means that you're not getting control. And so what I've taught police when I've got the opportunity, I don't do that much training. Try to be on the science and publishing side after the fact, is if you're not getting control within 5 or 10 seconds, you've got a broken wire, you don't have enough spread, then you want to deploy another probe, which is not a problem with the T10, or load another cartridge. And they don't limit firearms to 3 rounds. So it's really one of the silly things, but it has been used for criminal prosecution against police officers and a lot of civil lawsuits.
And no basis in science.
0.
Yeah. In fact, we don't have a clearance to show it yet, but there is a new video we're trying to get clearance to show where officers hit a guy who had a gun, and they kept the taser on for about 30, 40
When you
50.
say hit a guy, they deployed
They
taser.
deployed the taser, and he still had the gun in his hand. Had they stopped at 15 seconds, people recover fully right after the taser hit. So as soon as the stimulation's over, he could have responded, but they kept the current on while they went in, and they were able to disarm this person and get him under control. I think that's exactly the sort of situation where these arbitrary limits place police potentially at risk. Because if you have a policy that says you can't use it for more than 15 seconds, those officers would have had to either violate the policy and have the risks that come with that, or stop using the taser right in the middle of the fight.
It place police at risk, but we've also seen the cases, because we've talked about it, and we've tried to have conversations with police leaders, place suspects at risk, where they escalate, and it leads to a fatal officer-involved shooting, where if they continued with the taser and got them under control, they didn't, because of this myth of 15 seconds or 3 trigger pulls.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, if I were to argue on the other side, it's okay. So electricity doesn't build up like poison, but the effects can. And if you are continually stimulating somebody electrically, you got muscle contractions, and they can't breathe, then maybe that would eventually lead to fatality because they can't blow off the CO2 and reduce the level of acid. That was a popular theory for electrocution around 1910 and 1920. It wasn't until a little after that they finally figured out that it was VF. So no one's ever died from electrically induced acidosis. No human. Now, there are a couple of dog studies done. There was a dog study done around 1900 in which they intentionally delivered enough current to a dog to cause complete muscle lockup continuously. And so they were anesthetized and on ventilators. They couldn't really breathe, and they eventually killed them. But it was such an extreme situation, took so long. That's kind of like the exception that proves the rule. So there's really no reason to suspect that the acidosis could end up leading to fatalities. It's never been demonstrated in 150 years of research. And I think you're going to be talking to Dr. Ho in the future.
Yep, he's coming up in a few weeks on the show.
And he's recently done some studies where they had volunteers take 30, 40, 45-second doses, continuous, no breaks at all.
And we measured their breathing.
Well, because you don't interfere with breathing. That's number one. That's a really big factor. And if you're causing muscle contraction, you are going to generate lactic acid. You are going to generate some acid. But the body's pretty good at dealing with that.
Yep. All right. So I think we're getting down close to the end here. Let me just check my show notes. All right. So let's take a step back. like the point here is, if you're a police officer and you're watching this, we are not encouraging you to do longer duration than is necessary. You should only use the minimum force you need to get.
And abide by your current policy.
Yes. But what we are saying is there are extraordinary circumstances where sometimes police officers do have to use they can't get somebody under control fast enough. They may have to use longer durations. The reason that we're so passionate about this is we have seen this abused where officers are accused of murder in cases where, as we look at them, and you and your scientific colleagues are concluding there were very clear other causes of death, or that the taser did not play a role. And yet, police officers have been charged criminally, and some have been sent to jail. Like, tell us about the human cost of when these sort of unscientific allegations are able to prevail. Like, what are these doing to people?
Well, for one thing, it intimidates police officers. The most tragic case I can think of is Marcus Aberhart from East Point, Georgia. He and his assistant, Marcus Aberhart, was a sergeant, and Officer Towns trying to arrest somebody that had been strangling his girlfriend, and the suspect ran out in the woods, triggered an exertional sickling crisis. We know it because the sickling was found in his cells at autopsy.
What does that mean, real quick, exertional sickling?
Well, if you have sickle cell trait, normally you live a normal life, unless you go to high altitude or exert yourself. But your normal red cells under a sickling crisis will kind of curve up, and they fail to transport oxygen. And so it's a very painful death. It's really been demonstrated mostly in military recruits and in college athletes. So you're not getting oxygen to the legs, you can't walk, and it's very painful, and it spreads throughout the body. You're not getting oxygen to your organs, and you die. So they were trying to lift, Gregory Towns was the suspect, out of this creek that was full of snakes. And he's not getting up, and they thought that maybe he's just faking, doesn't want to cooperate. Well, he can't, because his legs aren't really working. So gave him a couple drive stuns in the shoulder area. He's not feeling any pain, because this is one of the most painful conditions you can have. And
so, by the way, he had collapsed of this condition and was down on the ground, and the officers had not yet used a taser.
Correct.
And then they came in and they used the drive stun, which we haven't really talked about necessarily in this episode. That's where you're touching the taser just to the person. It's usually used for like a pain compliance to get somebody to move or to react.
Right.
And so that's what happens here.
And so now they're trying to lift him up. And Sergeant Aberhart was using one arm to try to lift him up, and he had his X26 in his other hand. He was trying to exert himself and lift him up on the one arm, and he had a lot of inadvertent trigger pulls on the other hand, or what's called muscle mirroring. If you, say, lift 50 pounds with your left hand, your right hand will contract at around 15 pounds. It's really hard to control. The older you get, the harder it is to control it. And so he had a lot of trigger pulls there that were not delivering any current, but this was before your pulse graph, so you didn't know he wasn't delivering current. So the medical examiner saw those trigger pulls and said, yep, he was basically electrocuted by the taser weapon, and Officer Aberhart is in prison for life now.
So getting this stuff wrong has real consequences.
It does.
And I know that's a case we've actually been working with the prosecutor's office in Georgia to try to get a fresh trial to look at this, because the science is pretty compelling. I mean, when we think about the risks, you mentioned like with an electric fence, putting the current through the chest is the riskiest vector. When we do a drive stun, the current's in very close proximity. It can't run through big parts of the body. So it's, from a scientific perspective, it's much, I hate to say safer, but you can't cause electricity with a drive. You can't go current through the heart with a drive stun. It's just not physical.
That's exactly right. And the best analogy is a skin rub. for an ointment versus an injection of a drug. You're not getting into the body. It's a skin surface.
And we've seen these. And look, as we've seen more of these, media coverage and allegations that tasers are causing these deaths. And again, we've acknowledged there are deaths caused by taser weapons
From falls.
and from flammables, but these where they're pretty clearly removed, but there's still this fear of electricity, and they're prosecuting some officers criminally. In fact, we took some heat because in Ohio, there was a medical examiner that had listed in 3 consecutive deaths, had listed the taser as a cause. And because of that, like 15 officers were charged civilly and or criminally. And we sued the medical examiner, not for any money. By the way, this gets totally mischaracterized, like we're trying to intimidate the medical examiner. No, we just challenged her to defend her findings in court. And the court ruled in our favor from the bench. There was no scientific evidence. Medical examiners are people like me and you. It means they have opinions that are based more on their opinions than
Scientific fact.
the scientific fact. And when we were able to successfully unwind those decisions, which appeared more politically than scientifically based, we saved those officers from being wrongfully charged.
Yep, good for you.
And I know Mark does a lot of work helping defend officers in these cases and try to really get the scientific information into these cases so they're not making it based on innuendo.
Well, to be real accurate, I don't help defend them, but their lawyers help defend them. But regardless of what side asks me to come and testify, I've testified as a prosecution expert and as a defense expert in court on the effects of the weapons. I just try to explain the science and let the jury make the decision.
All right. Well, Mike, anything else you'd want to cover today? It's got a little deep in terms of the technology and the subject matters, a little intense.
I think we covered a lot. I mean, anything else, Dr. Kroll, that anyone watching let's call this probably the TASER safety episode, anything else that we didn't cover or that we didn't put in sort of terms that a police officer or a layperson might not understand to close with?
I think we pretty well covered things.
Rick, anything else? I know you're passionate.
Yeah.
We're all passionate about this, but you go deep. You know the science, maybe not, certainly don't know it as well as Dr. Kroll, but you know the science and you know about electricity.
Actually, there is one other. This is going to take a couple of minutes, but I think it's worth doing.
Sure.
Back in the 2004 timeframe, tasers were widely used. They became quite controversial. There were a lot of allegations about them causing deaths, etc. And coming out of that, there was a case in Canada of Robert Dzansky, who was a Polish man who had flown from Poland to Canada, and he experienced a medical crisis in the Vancouver airport. He grabbed a large stapler and was actively swinging it towards an officer when they hit him with the taser, and he subsequently died. Now, what was fascinating me about this case was because they put the cardiac defibrillator on him, they had rhythm strips. And do you remember what rhythm he was in?
Well, I'm sure it was asystole or PEA. He was in acute alcoholic delirium, and that can be fatal in itself, alcohol withdrawal syndrome.
So we had learned through the investigation that indeed he was a severe alcoholic who didn't get any drinks once you got on the plane. So he withdrew. And it was asystole. But what was tragic about this is this became a very hot political topic in Canada. They stood up a whole inquiry they called the Braidwood Inquiry, overseen by a former judge named Braidwood. And over the course of a year, they put on witness after witness. And they were conducting this. It was a show trial. And they were conducting this. It was very clear the taser had killed Mr. Dzansky. And everybody in Canada, frankly, was watching this. You would be convinced the taser is what killed him. For that entire period, they sat on those they had 3 independent autopsies that had looked at him, and they'd all concluded it was asystole, which is, again, the heart rhythm you cannot cause with an electric shock, and that the taser did not impact Mr. Dzansky's death. And only right at the end of this year, 18-month process did they finally acknowledge and release the autopsy reports. But by then, the public had been convinced that these officers were murderers and that the taser had killed Mr. Dzansky. And then in the final report, the political commission concluded the taser might cause ventricular fibrillation. And remember, we talked about this with our scientific and medical advisory board, which Dr. Kroll helped us set up with some of the leading electrocardiologists in the world. And they had concluded that there was nothing in the scientific evidence that supports that taser might cause ventricular fibrillation in a human. But this political commission had come to that conclusion. We actually tried to appeal this to the Supreme Court in British Columbia, but we were denied because they said this wasn't a court proceeding. This was a commission. And so they had no standing for us to challenge it. And that put us in this really awkward position where we then had to make a decision. Do we acknowledge in our warnings that the taser might cause ventricular fibrillation? And our scientific board, by recollection, said, no,
because it didn't, and it doesn't.
So our scientific board said, there was no scientific reason that we should make this change. But then we had to deal with our lawyers. And they said, look, now that this is out there, do you want to be explaining to a jury why we ignored the findings of the Braidwood Commission? Ignorance is not a defense, and neither would it be for our customers. If you were a police officer in the United States, we had to make warnings relevant to this. And so we spent a lot of time debating it. The lawyers won, and we said, look, we should lower the point of aim and say, when practicable, when you can, avoid lower, to avoid the chest area because of this controversy. Now, what was interesting was in the United Kingdom, the UK are the most conservative police in the world.
Sure.
They don't carry guns. It took like 3 or 4 years of testing. They spent millions and millions of tens of millions of dollars, I think, testing the taser before they deployed it. When we put out our warning, they asked us, okay, send us the underlying background information. And Dr. Kroll, do you remember what the Brits did with their point of aim?
I don't think they changed it.
They didn't. They came back and they said, oh, this is an American legal change. This is not a scientifically driven change. And to this day, John Oliver just made a big point of this, saying that we're being duplicitous. I'm giving you the real background. We had the science saying, don't do this. In fact, some of our experts said, we might be creating more problems by aiming lower. You're going to miss with the second dart more often.
Sure.
There were valid reasons we shouldn't lower it. But we tried to find that right balance to tell our customers, hey, we now have to deal with the finding of this commission. Even though our scientists disagree, we are going to put the information out there, be transparent, tell you should lower the point of aim when you can. But at the same point, if you, in a fast-moving situation, shoot somebody in the chest, our belief is the taser is not dangerous. In fact, do you know anybody who's a cardiac expert who went so far as taking a taser strike to the chest?
Yep, I did. And it was a great experience. And once was enough. Yep. Let me add to that, though. The United States Department of Justice had a year-long panel of experts that looked at this issue, among other things, and it was called Study of Deaths Following Electromuscular Disruption. And one of the conclusions was there is no evidence that there's a risk in deploying probes to the chest.
Now, to this day, actually, this is one of the things with TASER 10, because you can individually fire the probes, it now actually makes it a bit more practical that in circumstances where you have time and space, you can actually now even shoot right at the legs, which further avoids this. And when we say avoiding a controversy, what we're trying to do is for everybody. Like if you have somebody who's in this medical crisis and you deploy a TASER weapon on them, and they later die of complications, if you have a strike to the chest, you're much more likely to get sued or charged. If you're a police officer, that family is likely to go through the pain of believing that police officers may have killed their loved one. If we can avoid that by saying, look, fire the TASER darts at lower extremities, again, when allowable. So we're trying to find the right balance to be maximally safe, but the device has to be usable in the real world. And we also have to be careful not to overreact, or we end up with situations where like cops are getting thrown in jail.
Like in Georgia.
When somebody dies from a medical complication, that'd be like throwing an ambulance driver in jail when somebody who's in their care dies. Now, again, it's maybe slightly different in that a lot of times it's involuntary on the person that they're dealing with, but it can be a huge tragedy when these things get overstated and police are wrongfully, imprisoned or sued.
I've heard you tell that story before. I thought you were going to do your British accent. That's the way you usually tell the story when you talk about the legal profession here in the U.S. Well, Dr. Kroll, thank you for coming into the Bat Cave. Oh, you have one more thing?
Yeah, I have one mystery that I've thought about a lot, and I don't have an answer for it. I'll just present it. So I'm proud of my work improving on the implantable defibrillator in about 15 years of working on them, and I'd like to believe that has saved a lot of lives. What I wonder about is if my involvement with the TASER weapon, which I get a very small bit of credit for, but if the TASER weapon has actually saved more lives than the implantable defibrillators that I worked on. And I really don't know the answer to that, but I think they're roughly comparable.
Well, that's quite a statement. And you've had a huge impact. I mean, again, Dr. Kroll helped us establish our scientific and medical advisory board that's given us access to the best experts in the world. You've helped us design our safety testing. You've contributed your ideas and your inventiveness to our product development. And I think together we have saved a lot of lives, but we're just getting started. This next year, I think we're testing in the Nordic countries. They're looking at using a TASER as their primary weapon instead of a gun. Now that we have this new Apollo dart that can penetrate through the clothing effectively, yet safely. So I think we've saved a lot of lives, but we're just getting started.
That's great. Proud to be involved.
Well, that's a wrap on episode 9 of the Boldly Go podcast. As you know, we drop new episodes every Friday, which you can find on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And we hope not only do you watch the podcast, but you hit subscribe on any of those platforms. And you can find background information or behind the scenes information, usually on our X feed, which is at Mike Wagers or at Axon Rick. Or you can also follow us on LinkedIn, where we post a lot of stuff about the Boldly Go podcast. And with that, Rick, I think we will call this a wrap here. Thank you.
It's a wrap.
Thank you.